Good evening. Welcome to Public Forum. The just concluded 17th SAARC Summit in Maldives highlighted the areas of cooperation: trade, transport, economic integration, security, piracy, climate change, and good governance. The summit held under the theme of building bridges, focused on bridging the gaps created by uneven economic development and income distribution, the gaps in gender equality and how to fill them. In today's Public Forum, we discuss the summit and the challenges before. And joining me for more on this, a very esteemed panel. With me is Director General of Institute for Defence Studies and Analysis, Mr. N.S. Sisodia. Thanks very much, Mr. Sisodia, for joining us here. Also with me is the Vice Dean of Jindal School of International Affairs, Dr. Sreeram Chaulia. Dr. Chaulia, thanks very much for coming. Also with me, the senior journalist, the Hindu Sandeep Dixit. Thanks very much, Mr. Dixit, for joining us here. In the first segment, we try and look at the importance of SAARC. Has it really delivered on the promises it made in the past? Has the SAARC process given a fillip to a better understanding between the member countries? What has it achieved so far? Does politics stand as an impediment for economic cooperation? And getting straight into the discussion now, my first question to you. Do you think SAARC Summit 2011 is different from SAARC Summit 2010? We have moved forward. Building bridges was the theme this time, and we have been successful to some extent. When we talk about SAARC Summit, we talk more about the bilateral talks and bilateral meetings rather than SAARC Summit as a whole. Do you feel that we have the media especially has shifted this time and has focused on SAARC as a whole, or we're still focusing on what India and Pakistan Prime Minister had to say and talk on these issues rather than on a SAARC Summit as a whole?
Well, the Pakistan-India relationship is the building block. Because these are the two largest countries in the region and the two most populous as well. But if you take it as a block, 1.8 billion people, as Dr. Sisodia said, it actually begs for sane policy making rather than one that beats the trodden track of recriminations and sponsorship of terrorism and so on. So, in fact, terrorism, economic integration seem to be, negating, neutering each other for a long time. And the fact that both were on the agenda and one did not seem to eat into the prospects of the other is a hopeful sign. Economic integration, we should have, we always talk about the potential of SAARC. It just doesn't get realized because of lots of untoward incidents that keep occurring from time to time. So we have to think also about spoilers. Be it the media, be it armed forces in Pakistan, there is a whole set of constituents who would also want to...
Seeing the past history, Dr. Chaulia, do you feel in the past, we have completed 26 years, 17 summits of SAARC, do you feel that the past initiatives, past declarations made in this particular summit, things have really changed, we have moved forward because, South Asian Development Fund, or be it the Common Security Doctrine, and several other issues, especially on issues like climate change, food security, we heard big things, but do you really feel things have changed?
Yeah, SACTA, for example, 2004, we have come some distance, and all these reduction in duties, import duties, will go towards meeting those targets of SAFTA. And preferential trade agreements are essentially going to be the basis for shared prosperity in this century because the multilateral trading system has collapsed. So around the world, you see, the push towards greater economic integration. It's good that they put it at the forefront, and perhaps generational change as well as change possibly towards more civilian leadership and putting the militaries in the back seat is going to feed this positive momentum.
So you're extremely optimistic. You also have to realize that seeing the current scenario, the global scenario, you also have a compulsion realizing very well that European Union and especially the US are going through a major dip, and it's only the South Asian region which so far hasn't seen the impact of this global recession. And one thing is to boost your domestic demand. If you look at the figures, of the intra-regional trade, that stands at around 5% in South Asia, which is compared with over 50% in East Asia and about 20% in Latin America. So one way where we can really boost our trade from 5%, we can really climb up. And this is one issue where we really need to focus.
Yeah, even if you compare it with other regional organizations, you'll find that there are territorial disputes in many parts of the world. Thailand, Cambodia have been at loggerheads for a long time now over disputed territory. The entire East Asian region is roiled by counterclaims by the Philippines, Vietnam, and China over Spratlys and other islands. And if you look even Latin America, there's always been a huge rivalry between Brazil and Argentina, and even smaller ones regarding guerrilla groups in Colombia and so on. But what they've managed to do, be it Mercosur, be it ASEAN and elsewhere, is to moderate those through the prism of some kind of multilateral general interest rather than the particular interest of one or two players. And for that to happen, I think India and Pakistan, I think at least rhetorically seem to be realizing that they cannot hold the prosperity of the rest of the region, especially the small and least developed countries, to ransom because of their own wrangling. So what this process is doing is that the big ones have to show magnanimity, and the small ones are going to benefit from this, and it is going to create hopefully a circle of prosperity.
Themselves from India.
Well, it's also a question of how they envision India's growth and whether they can participate and also gain from it, or is it going to lead to relative gains where one state is growing superlatively while the others stagnate or are growing at a much slower rate, which can also lead to jealousy as well as insecurity. So this has been a long debate: absolute gains, relative gains. What do states really calculate? I think somebody gave the analogy of the United States to Mexico, and how despite all the objections to NAFTA in the mid-1990s, Mexico has actually gained and has been a net beneficiary of joining this free trade agreement, both in absolute numbers and in welfare statistics. So it's a question of whether you want to see a Cuba-like relationship with the United States or a Mexico-like relationship with the United States. India, in our own small context, is that kind of engine and driver of growth, and has the kind of private sector and the private sphere which is much more advanced than elsewhere in the rest of the region. And that means, ideology as well as politics are capable of being pushed to the back seat because of the strength of the private sphere in our own country. And I think they, especially exporters, for example, will have a huge stake in these trade agreements from going ahead. So I think overall the dynamic and the relative power between private and public has been shifting because of liberalization.
Is it right to say because of India's economic clout also SAARC somewhere? Dr. Chaulia, how will you actually compare SAARC with other regional groupings like ASEAN and even European Union?
I think the European Union had birth pangs that came out of World War, and the lesson of avoiding the catastrophe was paramount in the 1950s. And since then they've stumbled along the way and again regrouped. In the 1990s you had the economic union around the millennium, the monetary union around the millennium. All these steps have progressively, the EU's journey has never been a smooth one.
Dr. Chaulia, how do you feel that the developed world is looking at SAARC? Do you feel that international diplomacy is also decided, in a way, the kind of international business we do?
Well, apart from India, I think we were a basket case for a long time, this region. And as Mr. Sisodia mentioned, the volumes of poverty and all the human development indices are on par with sub-Saharan Africa. And so for a long time, this region has been seen as a humongous, sea of humanity, of lots of ill-clad and suffering and hungry mouths. So for that image to be transformed, I think India's growth story has somewhat affected that. But people still talk about, if you look at mainstream observers like Thomas Friedman, they're not talking about Bangladesh or about Sri Lanka or Bhutan. They're talking about the India story only. So for it to, go beyond that, again, we're going back to the previous segment, we were talking about how the prosperity needs to be shared. That has to happen. Even if Sri Lanka grows 8 or 10%, the size and the scale of it is so small, it really doesn't really excite the world per se. So South Asia, as a region to be taken seriously, it will need the prosperity to spread far more, and for some kind of common market to operate, possibly even a common currency, which has been envisaged for a long time. Because that is when the volumes we are talking about, from 1.2 billion market of India alone becomes a 1.8 billion market of all the consumers. That's how it adds to the the lure for the outside observer. The Goldman Sachs economists were sitting and talking about new emerging economies like Mexico, Indonesia, South Korea, and Turkey. He's not talking about South Asia as a whole. Right?
But in fact, recently we read that the US Foreign Policy magazine had come out with a survey which said that India is surrounded by the most failed states, and a group of failed states would be Bangladesh, Nepal, and in fact we did a show also on this issue that how's the future both for India and also for these states. And one thing was said that especially developed world comes with these kind of comments and surveys also to somehow legitimize that intervention in these countries.
Yeah, just going back to the caller, I think the fact that we are poor doesn't mean we should not cooperate, And in economic integration, there are two views on this. Generally speaking, regional economic integration can either serve the interests of advanced capitalist classes in societies, or it can be a different model where there is, the trickle down or whatever it is called, will eventually reach the masses. So even for our own society, I think the fact that we are poor doesn't mean that we are somehow disadvantaged by virtue of cooperating in regional. Rather, one can envisage a situation where, for example, the cost of food grains or of sugar will be moderated with the breakdown of these tariff barriers. So there is much for us to gain, including for the poor, through this exchange.
Okay, so
would India take any drastic action against Pakistan by army or by diplomatic?
Okay.
We can shift India to Southern Pacific or somewhere.
I'd like to take it.
Okay, yeah.
The problematic aspects of these relationships are undeniable, and I think they cannot be swept under the carpet. What we're talking about is an old phrase.
There's so much of anger and suspicion, because that's what you read when you get calls.
And it is based on objective realities as well of past incidents, and
so the media is highlighting various issues.
Right.
And they're talking about 24/7.
So what we have to think about is how to de-hyphenate the problematic security relationships from the economic ones. And I think to an extent, firewalling one from the other is not possible, because policy is one syncretic thing, and you cannot actually divide it and break it down to different segments sometimes. But especially when there's no incidence of major terrorist attacks for a while, and it looks like the other parties feel responsible enough to say let Ajmal Kasab hang to death, there is possibly a change of heart and possibly changing the structures, internal structures within the societies. So that is where I think we need to capitalize on the gains. And there is no telling, given the SARC story, and although we've been optimistic in this show, whether history will repeat itself and whether there is going to be a return to an atmosphere of hostility and animosity.
But unfortunately, this sort of political calamity, because not to forget, we had a composite dialogue with Pakistan, and then it went completely, in a stalemate also because of what happened in 26/11. So let's not forget, and we should also try and accept that economic ties is completely at the stake of what kind of political relations we have with a particular country.
Yeah, and as I said, as the stakeholders in the economic relationship increase, one reason why India and China have not, contrary to doomsday sayers, gone back to armed conflict is because of these stakeholders on both sides who don't want, $60 billion to stop flowing. Cordell Hull once said famously that if goods don't cross borders, then armies will. So we need to move in that track.
Final comments from you, Dr. Chaulia.
I think we have to also think about winners and losers of trade liberalization. As this momentum takes a leap, we have to think about who are going to be winning and who are going to be losing as a result of opening up of these markets. Lots of domestic producers, entrenched producers who had captive markets in form of a domestic population. Now they will be threatened. They can raise serious barriers. We are not talking about intelligence agencies and militaries. That's in the security sphere. Here there are also spoilers. And therefore, as we started the show, I said spoilers have to be taken along for this bandwagon to move forward. And I think one of the homeworks that each country has to do is to talk about which are the domestic constituencies that will feel hurt and that injured as a result of trade liberalization.